Welcome back to episode 3 of the Bible Connection podcast. We are so excited to be back and recording. This is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you along as you read in your Bibles. I am your host, Josh Williams. With me is my good friends Taylor Babcock.
Hey.
Brandon Stooksbury.
How's it going there?
And John Steinke.
Hello there.
So, guys, this week we are discussing Exodus. I think we're talking 1 through 20, or are we going to break it up 1:18?
We're going 1 through 20, but we're probably going to talk about up to the Red Sea, and
Okay.
then we'll pick up the next chunk in the second podcast, episode 4.
Episode 4. Okay. All right. So, getting started, how does Israel, being enslaved in Egypt under the dominion of Pharaoh, work with God's covenant promises that he made with Abraham?
So jumping all the way back to Genesis 15, we read that they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. So way long before they're in Egypt, we see that promise, and we see it unfolding as we get to Egypt. Genesis concludes with Joseph in Egypt, and then there's that 400-year period, and then we pick up with a new king that arose in Egypt who did not have that relationship. I think that previous Pharaoh was probably of the Hyksos dynasty. That's just my opinion. But we see that there's a new king that did not have a relationship, and the people of Israel are serving Pharaoh. And an interesting note there is that the word serve comes from the word abad, and it can mean both serve and worship. So when we see the Israelites and they're in Egypt, it's not just that they are, it's just not that they are enslaved physically to the Egyptian people, but we see that they have made an idol out of the Egyptian gods in the Egyptian lifestyle. So I think there may be a little bit of play on words there, because
I'm sorry to interrupt
go
you there,
ahead.
but that goes all the way back to the garden, because in the garden their role was to abad and shamer, to work and to till, and those same two words that play out again later in Israel's temple. That was the temple. That's what they were to do in the temple.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that pictures as being an image bearer of God, what they were created to be, people worshiping the Lord. And what we see here in the Exodus, or at the beginning of Exodus with the Israelites, is they're not worshiping God. They have made idols. And you read in Joshua 24, put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Ezekiel 20, do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. Ezekiel 23, your whoring began in the land of Egypt. We see that the Israelite people had not only become enslaved to the Egyptian people, but rather to their lifestyle. So as far as that covenant that is made, God is redeeming his people, and to redeem them at that present time in the early Exodus accounts requires that he redeems them from their idolatry and to pull them back into covenant.
So in talking about that, we see through Genesis that clearly God had intended that they would end up in Egypt, both in chapter 15, when he says, know for certain your descendants will be sojourners in the land of Egypt, and also with Joseph, when Joseph brings them down, delivers them from famine, he says, bring my bones back. Like he intended for himself to be, his bones to be brought back to the promised land to be buried. But in talking about redemption, there's some amazing imagery that both connects the people of Israel back into the covenant of Abraham and even the covenant of Noah, and still brings them forward also to what we see in Christ. So if you look at Moses at the beginning chapters of Exodus, he's put in this basket and he's put in the Nile. And one thing that I saw when I was studying is that the same word for basket is only used one other place in the entire Old Testament, and it's the word, the ark. The word is pronounced tibah, right? And so this basket that he's put in, as he's put into the waters of judgment, right? And he comes out with life. And so we can see the same thing happened with Noah. He was put through the waters of judgment, and he comes through on the other end with life. And that's how God brought redemption to him. And we're going to see the same thing repeated throughout the Old Testament and even into the waters of baptism, which is something I think we're going to pick up on in the future, so I don't want to spend too much time here.
Well, I think it's interesting as well that as Moses' mother prepares this ark, this typological ark, what she does with this ark is she coats it with it's the same word that is used in Noah, that he was to cover the ark with bitumen and pitch. That's the same wording that's used here that Moses' mother does to this little ark carrying Moses. So I think that's also another connection there.
Yeah, and I think that even as Moses ages and he has his children, you still see the connection of God's covenant promises with Abraham, because you see one of the weirdest verses in the entire book of Exodus in chapter 6. And suddenly in verse 24, after God's told him to go to the Pharaoh, it looks like the Lord just wants to kill him, like out of nowhere. Like the Lord's about to kill Moses until his wife circumcises his child faithfully. And so it shows that because Moses had not circumcised his child, he was not obeying the covenant that God had given to Abraham, and the Lord's anger burned against him. So I think there's a really clear connection about this is no accident that the people of Israel are not forgotten by God, but this covenant is continuing from the time of Abraham.
So we see kind of Moses, this picture of Israel being enslaved in Egypt. You know, Moses is planned to be the guy that kind of speaks on behalf of God to take them out of this enslavement. And then we get to the plagues. So what is the significance of the plagues over Egypt, and what are we supposed to learn about God when we read about them?
To start, I want to talk about the staff of Moses versus the crook or the comparable staff of Pharaoh. If you look in Egypt and many of their temples, the one that comes to my mind today is the Temple of Karnak. It's well preserved. You can see depictions of Pharaoh holding a crook, a shepherd's crook, in which that is a symbol of his authority. Often you'll see these depictions with one hand raised high, showing his authority. So what we see is Moses has a stick, and in some instances Aaron, which that stick is a symbol of God's authority. So when we get into the plagues and then we see all these commands given, and then we see everything laying out, there is a judgment being laid out. Exodus 12:2 says, "And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments for the purpose of demonstrating who has ultimate authority and who is supremely in power." And that's God, not the Egyptian gods and not Pharaoh. So we see between them that when Pharaoh's stick was a symbol of authority, that God's authority is greater than his. When we read in Exodus 7, it says, "For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs." Not snake swallowed up their snake, but rather Aaron's staff swallowed up their staff. Basically saying God's authority is greater than their authority. And we see a clear depiction, and that's really what the plagues are demonstrating, is that God is supremely in authority and has all power over anything that they have.
And if that connection seems a little vague, the Lord himself says that's why he does the signs and the plagues of Egypt. If you go to Deuteronomy 4:34-35, "Or has God attempted to go and take a nation out of another nation by trials, signs, wonders, war, by a strong hand and an outstretched arm, by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? You were shown these things so that you would know the Lord is God, and there's no other beside him." So when we talk about the plagues, like that should be our first reading when we see them. The Lord's authority is greater than the authority of the Egyptians. The Lord's power is a power that truly reigns over these no gods that are the Egyptians. And so he humiliates the entire Egyptian pantheon. It may not be immediately apparent to the readers, but the Egyptians, they had a pantheon of gods that they worshipped, multiple different gods that were in charge of different aspects of what they considered to be creation. And so when the Lord brings on these plagues, they're not just random, hindrances on the people, but they're specifically an affront to the beliefs of the Egyptians. the Egyptians under the Pharaoh, their first attack against the Israelites was to take their young boys and throw them into the Nile, both trying to counteract God's call for them to be fruitful and multiply, and to destroy them and to kill them. And then the first two plagues that are sent against the Egyptians are turning the Nile into blood, which was an affront against the gods of the Nile, Osiris and Nu and Hapi. And then this plague of frogs. And frogs were a sign of fertility in Egypt. They even had a god named Heket that had a picture, a goddess named Heket that had a picture of a frog for her head, who was supposed to help in childbearing. And so the Lord comes in and he humiliates these gods by showing his power. And you see the sorcerers are trying to duplicate it at first and showing that they can do the same thing. But what's really hilarious is that like they can make more frogs, but they can't get rid of them. So they're just making the problem worse. And then continuing to each one, I don't want to spend too much time, but like when you look at the gnats aren't just popping out of thin air. He creates the gnats out of the dust, which would have been an affront to the god of the earth, which was Geb. And then he takes these plague of the flies, which would have been an affront against Kepher. Now, a lot of people specifically think these flies might have been actually flying scarabs, and he was a god depicted by a flying scarab. In the fifth plague of the livestock, there was a literal bull that was always at the temple of Memphis that was called Apis, and he was an actual bull that would walk around, and the Lord struck down the livestock. The boils would have been against Amun-Ra and Thoth and Sekhmet and Imhotep, which were all false gods that they trusted for healing. The hail would have been against so many, like a plethora of gods that were in charge of the weather and moisture and the sky and the atmosphere. The locust would have been against the Egyptian god of Min, who was the patron god of the crops, which was the favorite god of the Egyptians. And the crops were completely annihilated by these locusts. And so much so that the Egyptians immediately were begging for Pharaoh to let the people go. And when he still wouldn't lament, the Lord completely decimated their understanding of the great God of Egypt, Amun-Ra, the God of the sun, by spreading darkness over the land. So each of these plagues is showing God's utter authority and leaving no question in the mind of the Israelites that God is the true God and there are no other gods before him.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, last week we didn't speak about how Genesis ended in chapter 50, and what we're saying about God, Yahweh, as He's revealed Himself, I am that I am. How He's revealed Himself to His people here. Genesis ends with Joseph telling his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people would be kept alive as it is to this day." So even in Joseph's brothers' sin, their wicked plans, God was using that sin to deliver a people. And in this time of we've been talking that the people of Israel were in Egypt for 400 years. There was other things that God was doing in this time. The same passage that we talked about in Genesis 15. We learn that not only is God going to preserve His people in Egypt, but He was also in that same passage in Genesis 15 that He says that the I'm trying to think of how it's worded, but the iniquity of the Amorites has not complete yet.
Or the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Not yet complete, yeah. So there's multiple things going on, and so we should come at this with a view of God that He is sovereign, and He is sovereign over all things, whether good or evil. Right. So we should keep that in mind. And we also should keep in mind, when we learn Yahweh tells Moses He's going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that this will not happen, so that there can be this spiritual warfare that's playing out in the battle of the gods, right? So there's multiple things going on here.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, if we have time, we plan on expounding upon that. But
can I jump back to one thing that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of bridged off of what John. So John was going through all of the plagues, and one thing that I want to mention is Pharaoh's role in all of this. So in the Egyptian worldview, Pharaoh is an integral part of the function of the universe. In Egypt, they call that Ma'at, M-A-A-T. It basically means order, and everything was in order. The sun rose because Pharaoh mediated with Amun-Ra to make that happen. I don't know the different gods of Egypt, but Pharaoh was the one mediating each and every one of those gods to do their specific practice in order to keep things together, and they would call that Ma'at. So it was Pharaoh's responsibility to do that, and I think that the Israelites were conflicted in their worldview of what was to happen. Like I said earlier, the Hebrews became slaves to Egypt before they became slaves in Egypt. They loved this Egyptian lifestyle. In Exodus 16, it says, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." They'd rather go back to Egypt and be slaves and to have that lifestyle once again. That's how badly they wanted that. So God is redeeming them out of that. And I forgot my next point.
Well, I find it really interesting you're talking about the Pharaoh. I left him out because I also left out a plague. The 10th plague, which I assume is going to be a separate question, Josh, so I won't get too much into it.
It's coming up.
The 10th plague targets the son of the Pharaoh along with the firstborn of all of Egypt. But this Pharaoh wasn't just a mediator for worship. He was also the image of the gods, right? When Pharaoh was reigning in Egypt, he was literally supposed to be the image of Amun-Ra, the image of the gods throughout his land. And so he'd build these monuments, these huge construction projects with his face all over the land so that people knew when they walked into Egypt, this is the land of the gods of Egypt. And this is in contrast to what we're told in Genesis 1:26-28, that we are made in the image of God, therefore be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have dominion. When we go out, we're supposed to be servant kings that are imaging God as we go throughout creation, the same calling for the Israelites. So this next plague is going to be an affront that shows God's true power. He doesn't allow for the death of Isaac. Rather, he brings a substitutionary death. And we're going to see something very similar, that the children of Israel are not going to be killed while the firstborns of Egypt are. So
I remembered what I was going to say. So the Hebrews became slaves to Egypt in that lifestyle before they became actual prisoners to them. So in redeeming them, the purpose of all these plagues is to demonstrate who actually is God. Not the Egyptian gods, but rather Yahweh. And what we see in Exodus chapter 9, Egyptians believing in God. Whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses when speaking of the plague. And then we see in the Exodus, as they're leaving, there's a mixed multitude alongside the Israelites that also went up with them, and they were exiting. So it wasn't just the Israelites, actually. There were other people outside of the Hebrews that put their faith in God because of the demonstration of the 10 plagues that was put before them.
And speaking as a non-Jewish man, amen, I'm so encouraged that the Lord has always been a God that offers redemption and mercy to the nations.
Yeah, and can I, as we're entering into the last plague, I'd like to draw attention to each of the plagues. The plagues come and they are targeted at the Egyptians, right? They're targeted specifically, whether it's the gnats, whether it's the boils, whether it's the frogs, whether it's the locusts, whether it's the darkness we see, whether it's the hail, lightning.
I'd say the Egyptians and on all the gods of Egypt.
Yes. I'm sorry. Great clarification there. But what we don't find is this judgment coming upon Israel, right? Until the last plague.
Let's get into that one.
Yeah. So what we need to pay very close attention to is judgment at this point does not escape Israel, because in the text the judgment is always clearly going to Egypt and Egypt's gods, but it comes it comes to the homes at this point, and this is where we see that the Passover lamb is slain, and this blood is applied to the lintel here, in causing the angel of death to pass over.
So here's the question I'm going for. So we see the institution of the Passover in Exodus 12. Talking about that, how does it connect with what we saw from Genesis, and how will it remain significant throughout the whole Bible, this institution of Passover?
So, I mean, I really think that this is a center theme of the Scriptures.
Absolutely.
Before the foundation of the world, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. If you could receive any picture from the book of Exodus, you want to see the Passover lamb. So when you look at the Passover, what you see is the Lord is going to bring death upon the firstborn of all of Egypt and of all of Israel, if not for a substitutionary atonement. If there's not an innocent, spotless lamb that dies in their place, if they don't keep the Passover the way it's been commanded, from the rituals of boiling the meat, not leaving any until the next day, and leaving no leaven within their bread, then the Lord will bring judgment on them. And so this is picked up throughout the Scriptures in so many ways. It's supposed to be a festival remembered throughout their generations, because it's ultimately going to find its fulfillment in the person and the work of Christ. Christ is the Paschal Lamb. Christ is the Lamb of God sent to take away the sins of the world. And when he institutes the Lord's Supper the night before he's tried and he's about to be executed, he takes the bread and he breaks it and says, "This is my body broken for you." And he takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood that is poured out for you." And when Jesus dies on the cross, he's effectively doing the same thing that was done for the Israelites here. And so one of the things that's really important to remember as we read through Exodus is that all of these things are concerning Christ, but they're concerning Christ in a lesser way. So what I mean by that is, I've seen a really beautiful description of this recently, where if you're on vacation for months, maybe not vacation, maybe you're working for months and months away from your wife, and you want to remember what she looks like, you may have a photo that you look at to remember what she looks like. But when you're back home and you're with her, you don't stare at the photograph while holding her hand. You have the real thing right there in your hand. You can embrace her at your leisure. And so the Israelites were given this image of the Paschal Lamb, the Passover Lamb, and it was to teach them the truth concerning Christ. But we have the benefit now of being united with him. We have a fuller picture. And so we shouldn't revert back to animal sacrifices. That's not what we're called when we see this shall be a festival throughout your generations. Rather, we should trust in the teachings of the New Testament and see that this is the fulfillment that Christ has done on the cross.
Mm-hmm. Very well said.
And go ahead, Taylor.
I was going to say, as you were talking about Passover, I was looking at, there are 4 cups that are drank at Passover, and they're in commemoration and point to everything you just said. So the first cup of sanctification, I will bring you out of Egypt. The second cup, the cup of deliverance. I will deliver you from Egyptian slavery. The third cup, the cup of redemption, I will redeem you with my power. And the fourth cup, a cup of restoration, I will take you as my people. Which building off of that.
So do these come from like Jewish tradition of the Passover, how to celebrate it?
Oh, no, this is I forget what chapter this is in, but this is laid out, and this is what they would, I will look up the verse on that later.
we'll talk
I don't
about it
remember off the top of my head, but there is significance to that, why they drank those in commemoration of that.
Well, in reading this, I'm now that I have children, I read this completely different. Because as when you read this before you have children, you kind of, or if you read it as a child or in an adolescent, at least I did, it sounds really strange that you would celebrate the Passover, that the head of the household would celebrate the Passover with the sandals on his feet, with the staff in his hand, the belt around his waist, right? And you were to eat it in haste, right? In haste, coming out of Egypt. And we're going to see this as well with the Feast of Booths, that they would go outside the homes and they would experience, that as they would be a part of this Passover, the children in the home, and not just as we saw earlier, it's not just the children, but it's those that sojourners, that are coming into Israel, to the strangers that are coming. They are to see this. They are to see this reenactment every year, right? And they are to experience what these Hebrews, as they are coming out of Egypt. This is to be a teaching thing that they would have seen. You know, it's not just words, but the children would actually see this. And if we're good parents, and we would take this. There's so much wisdom in this in this section of the Passover.
If you lived in Egypt and you put a slaughtered animal's blood across the top of your doorpost, you were detestable to any and every Egyptian living there. The Egyptian gods were often personified through all these different animals, and to have animals, shepherds were detestable within the area that they lived. So to have thousands of animals slaughtered or lambs slaughtered, in which blood was from the doorpost, was a test of the Hebrews' faith. They were putting their lives on the line, doing that in Egypt where they were. So they communicated that by doing that they believed in the promise that God had promised them. Ultimately, that is fulfilled in Jesus. And then we see shortly thereafter, I want to talk about the night of watching. So you have Passover, and then the night right after Passover, they left with haste, as Brandon and John mentioned. They left with haste, and we see in Exodus chapter 12, host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of their land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. So the Passover was remembrance of what happened, and it showed their faith. When they left, the night of watching was something that they also did as a commemoration, showing their faith, to believing what God had promised them. So for God, the night was a night of watching because he protected and watched over Israel. Jews would watch the night after Passover, recognizing God as their protection. So when we fast forward to the New Testament and we see Jesus, the night after Passover, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what is it that he says to his disciples? He says, watch with me. That very night, he says, watch with me. And he actually even questions, you couldn't even watch with me for an hour. What is Jesus saying there? He's saying, worship the Father for the protection that he gives. And so Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, not saying, watch out for guards or whatever, but rather that practice all the way back from Exodus that we read here, that we should praise the Father for the protection that he gives us, commemoration all the way back what they did in Exodus and protecting his people as they left Egypt.
So something I want to add into here, I know that's not scripted with the questions, but last week we asked, is Joseph a type of Christ? And so tonight I want to discuss Moses as a type of Christ. And so I think that we've already somewhat discussed this with him being put into the Nile as a baby. When he was put in there as the basket, it's the same word as the ark. But when you look after this night of watching, after the Passover, the people of Israel all flee to the Red Sea, and the Egyptians come after them. And there's so many thoughts that should be coming to your head. First, why are these idiotic Egyptians chasing these Israelites? I would be terrified out of my mind to chase after them with the literal presence of God burning like a fire in front of you. But you could ask the same thing about the people who arrested Christ the night of his arrest before they crucified him. This was the same Jesus who went from town to town, healing the blind, casting out demons, speaking with authority, controlling the weather, multiplying food. They tried to stone him, and he would just pass through the crowd, whether that was like time freezing or intangibility. I don't know. As a science fiction nerd, like I always wanted to picture what that miracle is. But like they have the nerve to arrest Jesus. And I think that we're supposed to see this as an image where Moses, it says in Hebrews, is faithful over God's house as a servant, but Jesus is faithful over God's house as a son. I think that we're supposed to view them comparatively here. Because when they come to the Red Sea, the people of Israel, they don't believe. They despair. And what do you see the disciples doing when Jesus is arrested? Well, they despair. They desert him. And then God parts the Red Sea. And so I think the Red Sea is an image we're supposed to see as the people pass through the waters of judgment. The Israelites, it says in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 4, Paul says they were baptized into Moses. But we're baptized into Jesus, looking at Romans 6 and Galatians 3. They identified with him, and we identify with Christ. And so Moses led his people through the waters of judgment to the other side, and that's what Christ does through us. When we look at the ordinance of baptism, we're buried with Jesus by baptism unto death and raised with him in a new life. And the waters of baptism are a picture of that. And so I don't want people to miss, again, seeing Jesus in this story. He's there. He's radiating like the light that's come into the world.
Yeah, one quick thing on that, and I love that we call this the Bible Connection podcast because it's kind of there's multiple angles that we're connecting themes from Genesis to Revelation, but we're also connecting with the church in our Bible reading plan and in a couple other ways. But that being said, you were talking about Moses and Christ. You can't read the Sermon on the Mount without seeing the imagery of God giving the law through Moses at the Mount, right? That I think the Gospels are written with that in the background, that Jesus is a new and better Moses. So yeah.
Okay, look, I can't under good conscience not finish out with this last question. So we're going to go a little bit longer, but I think it'll be worth it. So what does it mean when God says that if Israel will obey his voice and keep his commandments, then they shall be a kingdom of priests? So we're after the Exodus, we see Moses going to Mount Sinai and this presence of God, and we see this this covenant that's being made. What do you guys think? What does it mean when God says that?
Well, we definitely will touch on that some more in our next episode. That can't be something we avoid. Exodus 19 deserves a lot of time. But if I was going to really quickly, in connection with what we've discussed so far, talk about this, I would remind you that that's what Adam was called to be in the garden. Adam was told to be a king. Not explicitly, but it would have been understood. The image of God was what Pharaoh did for the people. And Adam being created in the image of God, and Eve being created in the image of God, they were kings that were displaying God's glory in the garden. And yet servants that were acting like priests when they're told to work and to keep the garden. Those are the words given to the priesthood of the people of Israel. And so just as Adam was a priest worshiping in his garden sanctuary, we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests that are devoted to the ministry and the ways of the kingdom of God among the nations. And so Israel was receiving that in part. If they would obey God's voice and keep his covenant, they would be a part of that kingdom of priests that would spread God's glory, that would build sanctuaries and spread gardens, if you will, metaphorically throughout creation.
Anybody else want to expound on that?
I would like to talk about it more on our next episode, but
We will.
That's fair.
Okay. We'll give it a lot of time.
All right. Well, remember, guys. First of all, thank you guys for joining in with us.
Pleasure.
Without you guys, we wouldn't have any reason to do this. So, and we enjoy it so much. But remember, you can share your questions with us at thebibleconnectionbdbc@gmail.com, and this will be up on the screen for you to see. Or you can just simply leave a comment on the video here on YouTube, or see us in church and ask us questions. We are totally down for it, right? So thanks for being with us.